Hello, grade 11. We're now going to do database connectivity for your PAT. This is based not on the scenario that you have, but it's a similar concept. Obviously, you're going to have a whole lot of tab sheets which represent your different tables. So you have a start button and you go to the different tables using tab sheets. So this tab sheet is dedicated to the table called Sport. And this is a tab sheet dedicated to the table called Learners. This is not the scenario that you have, but it's similar. It's the same concept. So here's the database. Remember your database tools, you have your relationship, and you must have a relationship diagram. You have to have one-to-many. In this case, it's one sport. It's played by many learners, and a learner can only play one sport. Now, to connect to the database with Delphi, we get a data module, file, new, and other, and then you choose Delphi files and you click on data module over there, click OK, and then we have our data module. Now this must be saved. We go file, save as, and store it in the same folder where you find your PAT. Okay, you can save it as a name. Unit, you can call it data module or DM PAT or whatever you want to call it. And then you also have to have a name here. This data module 2, you can call this PAT DM or whatever you want to call it. Must not be the same name as the file name that you've stored on the hard drive. So take note of this name over here is different to the name that's there. That is the name that is stored on the hard drive, the file that's stored there in the folder with your other program, and this is the main program. Now in the main program you have to have this file here, dmpat, in the uses section, so you make sure that it is there in the main program. You make sure that you have dm, see it's dmpat. Take note that is the name that is stored on the hard drive. Okay, so there's your data module, and then we have another name over here that we're going to use in code, which is not the same as that name there. Now in the data module you've got to put a connection component. So we go to the right hand side here, you find dbgo. In dbgo you'll see Adio connection, so you're going to put that in there, and then you use an Adio table. Under dbgo you find Adio table, click one, put one there. And then there's two tables, so I'm going to put two Adio table components. And lastly, you need a query component. So Adio query, and you put that there. Then you're going to go to the data access section over here, and you find data source, and you're going to put one next to each table. Data source next to each table. It must be data source. Okay. Now those are the components you need on this data module form, but you must name them. So this Adio connection here, I'm going to click on it and I'm going to give it a name. Go to the name property, call it conpat, whatever you want to call it, and then you click that tick next to login prompt. You untick it because you want it false. You don't have to log in each time you go to connect to the database. And then the connection string property of the the connection component. Remember, it was a connection component, not an Adio table component. Click the three dots and you build a string, and you use jet 4.0, and you go to next, and then you go and click on the three dots there to select your database. It'll go straight to the folder where your program is. If you save this data module, then you click on your database. It must be a .mdb database, not ACCDB, it must be MDB. You click on open, and then you test the connection, click OK, then you remove the path, and you just have the database name there, remove admin, test connection, and click OK, click OK, click OK. So there's conpat connected. Remember, it was under dbgo where we found the Adio connection. Now we have the Adio table components. Those must be named according to your table name, sport and learn in this case. So I'm going to call this Adio table component TBL Sport. So I'll go to the name property, TVL Sport. It's going to correspond to the table that we are connecting to. And then we go to the connection component, connection property, and you choose conpat. It's this thing over here that we're connecting to. And then you go to the table name property, choose the table that you want, and then click on active equals true. You're going to do the same for Adio table 2, and that's going to be called name property, TVL learners, TVL learner, and the connection property will be the same as the other one because there's only one Adio connection, compat. Then you go to the table name property, choose the correct table. Yeah, I'm recording it. And then we go to the active property equal true. Okay, so we connected that one to these things, and then we go to Adio query. Now this is slightly different. We just give a name for it, QRY pat, whatever you want to call it, and then we go to the connection component and we choose the Adio connection component, compat, that one. Right, that's all you do with the query. You're going to have to put queries in your pats if you want to get good marks. Right, and queries are relatively new. So now we're going to go to the data source property for each one of these tables. The data source, you click on it and you've got to name the data source, DSR, and then the Adio table component name that you are going to connect to. So this data source is going to connect to TVL Sport, so I call it DSR TVL Sport. Then in the dataset property, I'm going to choose TVL Sport. That's all. Now the next data source, I'm going to call that one DSR TVL Learner. And in the dataset property, I'm going to call it I'm going to use TVL Learner. So we're choosing this Adio table. Then the same for the query. The data source is going to be called DSR query pat. So it's going to be called, because we want to connect to that Adio component, the query component there, which is not the same as these, remember. And then the data set property, we choose query pat. So that one's connected to that one, that's connected to that one, that's connected to that one, and those three are connected to this one. Right, so that's your data module done. You don't have to do anything more there. Now we have to go connect our database grids. So you see there's a database grid that is for the TVL Sport. So I'm going to click on the database grid, then I'm going to go to the data source property of the database grid. Okay, I'm going to call it pat dm dsr TVL Sport. See how it's connected. Now you can see it in the database grid. TVL learner, TVS, this tab sheet learner. Click on the database grid, then go to the data source property and choose DSR TVL learner. How did we get a database grid? Well, you go to, let me just make this larger so you can see how we did it. Actually, I'll do it over here. No, I'll make another tab sheet, sorry, and we'll make another tab sheet and we'll put a database grid on for the queries. So I'm right click on page control, add new page. So there's my new tab sheet. By the way, if you want to make your tab sheets larger, you have to make the page control larger first. So you click on the page control at the top, and then you change the size, and then the tab sheets change with it. Make sure you're clicking on the tab sheet when you want to add items to it. For instance, you click on the left hand side in the structure view. You see I'm clicking on tab sheet 1 there now. I'm going to put a database grid here. I'll go to data controls, and you'll see TDB grid. Click on that and draw the database grid on, and then we're going to go down to the bottoms over here, the properties, and choose a data source. In this case, I'm going to use the query path. That means any queries that we might put in here will display on this database grid. Now, for instance, I'm going to go and put a query to display all the fields of the learner table. Okay, now the learner table is like that, and I want to display all records of the learner table. So then I'm going to have to say with Now we've got to quote the data module name, and the data module name is not the file name, but this thing over here, patdm. You'll also see it over here, patdm. Can you see patdm is not the same as dmpat. Dmpat is a hard drive, the files stored on the hard drive, but this patdm is our module that we use, the name that we use in code. So we say with that do begin and end. Then we say we're going to quote the query component now. Remember our query component was called query pat. There it is. So I say qry pat dot active equals false, and then I say following query pat dot sql dot text equals select. I want to display everything. Select star from learner. Simple little query, and then you make the active property to be true. Now, I don't know whether we've got the set grid column widths in here. Yes, we do. Thank goodness we have the set grid column widths. That means we can nicely organize the grids on the database grid. The columns will be neatly aligned. I mean, in other words, they won't take up the whole space. If you want to go and use that set grid column width, this is the time that you do. You say set grid column widths, and in brackets db grid 1. You put the name of the db grid that you want to set the grid column widths to, and it has to be the same name after this. For this query pat, the name for that query pat, the name of the database grid that connects to that is called db grid 1, and that's why I can put db grid 1 in there. And with TBS Sport, etc., etc., if you want to set the grid column widths nicely, then for that, every time you do, you have to do the active property false, table name, active property true. This is a TBL component, okay? And then you say set grid column widths, and then you'll see everything will be nice. I'll run the program. Okay, it would be a good idea to spell it correctly. Use file and use. Oh, because I've got another module here which I don't want to actually use, so I'm just going to get rid of that. I had another data module here, I just want to not use it. There we go. Run program reset. Whenever your program freezes, just say run program reset, okay? Could not use file and use. Okay, this is yeah, this is just a slight problem there. Anyway, it does normally work. I've shown you what you have to do. That code, when you want to set the grid column width, you do it after you've run a select query, or after you've run in this case, a TBL active, false, and true, and then you set grid column width. That's how you actually use the set grid column width. Okay, I hope that helps.